Okay, so I want to go through standardized field sobriety tests, kind of walk through what they are and walk through with examples. I'm going to have some audience participation today. So the standardized field sobriety tests are developed by NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. They're called standardized because throughout all 50 states, the NHTSA manual is used to train police officers. So it doesn't matter what police department you go to or law enforcement agency you go to, you're literally learning from the same manual. You're learning the same set of field sobriety tests. And there are three. The first is the Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus test, or the eye test as most people call it. Horizontal Gaze Nystagmus is testing your eyes for a particular type of nystagmus. Nystagmus is the involuntary jerking of the eyes. Right now, as you look into any of the eyes for the folks next to you, you'll see that your eyes appear to be steady, okay? But when you drink, it affects first your judgment, then your small muscles, then your large muscle groups. And the smallest of our muscles are the muscles that control our eyes. So when you drink, it affects your small muscle groups, and your eyes lose their ability to not jerk, and you'll be able to see that. And that's the nystagmus that we're talking about. But it's only one kind of nystagmus. So this test is designed to ensure that the officer, if they administer the test correctly, only sees this particular type of nystagmus, okay? Because there are dozens of other types of nystagmus. For example, there's something called rotational nystagmus and post-rotational nystagmus. If you spin a person and you were able to look at their eyes while they're spinning, you will see that same nystagmus, the jerking of the eyes. If you stop them after they've been spinning, you'll see the same jerking of the eyes. If someone is facing traffic and they're actually following traffic, you'll see the jerking of the eyes as opposed to smooth movement. So that's why officers are trained to position the person away from traffic so that they're not looking at traffic or a train that's going by, things that could otherwise cause this jerking of the eyes. So what does the jerking of the eyes look like? If you imagine a windshield wiper going across a wet windshield, that's what the normal movement of your eyes should look like, okay? Now imagine what we've all seen happen when your windshield wipers get turned on when it's not raining outside and it shakes as it goes across your windshield. That's exactly what it looks like when your eyes display nystagmus. So a proper administration of the horizontal gaze nystagmus begins by qualifying the person to take the test. The first thing the officer is supposed to ask is whether or not they've had any recent head injuries, okay? Because head injuries are something that could affect the presence of nystagmus, okay? The officer should also be clued into whether or not there's been a recent accident, right? So whether or not the person says they've had a head injury, if their airbags were just deployed and there's a chance that the person had a head injury, something the officer should keep in mind in determining whether or not this person should take the test. The other thing that the officer is going to do to screen the person to take this test is check for equal pupil size, okay? Because if you have a blown pupil, again, it's going to tell the officer that you're not a good candidate to take this test. They might be seeing something other than horizontal gaze nystagmus or nystagmus, the nystagmus that they're looking for. So the officer is going to hold up a stimulus, typically it's a pen or a pen with a light at the top of it, and they're gonna tell the subject to look at their light while they're asking these preliminary questions. As they're looking at the stimulus, before the officer ever begins to move the stimulus, the officer is also making sure that the person doesn't have what's called resting nystagmus, which a small percentage of people have, the actual visible shaking of the eyes before you even conduct the test. So all those things are happening before the officer actually starts the test. As you review DWI videos, you need to see the officer doing these things, asking these questions, holding the stimulus up 12 to 15 inches away from the face, and seeing whether or not the person has resting nystagmus and has asked these qualifying questions, okay? These are standardized tests, meaning if the officer doesn't do it exactly as prescribed, then the results that they claim to see may or may not be valid, okay? All that's happening before we've even started the test. Then I'm gonna have a volunteer come up. If you were a suspect in a DWI and I was the officer, I would say, I'd like you to look at the tip of my pen, and I would right now be checking for equal pupil size and to make sure that you do not have resting nystagmus, which you do not. Then I would do a preliminary set of passes. So I want you to follow the tip of my pen with your eyes and your eyes only.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to pause right there to explain what I've just done. I have conducted 2 passes, checking both eyes, and I've checked for equal tracking. Equal tracking means that I'm observing the subject's ability to track the stimulus with their eyes and follow the tip of my pen. Then I'm going to actually conduct the next pass, and of course the officer would not have taken a break here, the break that I've taken to explain. And you're going to continue to follow the tip of my pen with your eyes and your eyes only. Okay, so that second pass, even though it may have looked the same to observers, was checking for lack of smooth pursuit. So this is where I've actually started the test, and there is a prescribed time that it's taking me to get from the tip of your nose to this extent, which is generally going to be the width of your shoulders, and that's 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back, 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. And that's required. A lot of times you'll see officers do something like this. Okay, and that's not what the manual says, right? It has to be the 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. And there I'm looking for the lack of smooth pursuit, which is exactly the windshield wiper going over a dry windshield kind of example that I gave, okay?
Okay.
The next part of the test is beginning now. Once again, I'm going to check each eye. This time I'm only going to do 1 pass, but an officer would actually do 2, but for sake of time, do that. Okay, so an officer would repeat what I just did twice. This is a test for distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation, which is a very fancy way of saying, if I take the stimulus out to maximum deviation, which is 45 degrees if I'm out to your shoulder, then I'm looking for nystagmus, the jerking of the eyes, when I hold it there. And I'm holding the stimulus there for 4 seconds. Okay, once again, that's a prescribed time. So in my mind, I was counting the 1, 2, 3, 4 as I held the stimulus out at maximum deviation, which is what an officer is supposed to do. Once again, you see officers do this test, bring it out here, and 2 seconds later, they're back here. 2 seconds later, they're back in the middle. Okay, but it has to be distinct and sustained, meaning that 4-second count. And the officer is essentially now looking at an eyeball that appears to be just hitting it against something and coming back. That's exactly what it looks like, almost like a bouncing ball. The final pass for horizontal gaze nystagmus is when the officer takes this stimulus, they move it out. Now this time, they're going to move it out until they see the nystagmus begin. And here they're looking for onset prior to maximum deviation or prior to the 45-degree angle. So now we've done a qualification to see if you're a good candidate to take the test. I've asked the qualifying questions. I've checked that you can actually track my stimulus, all of that qualifying you to take the test. And the test itself had 3 parts. The first, lack of smooth pursuit, which is 2 seconds out, 2 seconds back. So as you're reviewing videos and looking at whether an officer administered the test correctly, that's one of the easiest things you can look for, is the time it took for him to take the stimulus out and back on that first pass. You can also look at when he took it to maximum deviation for that second clue, if he actually held it out there for 4 seconds each time. So 4, 4, 4, 4 again. You can also look for the total number of passes, because if they're doing it correctly, they've done all these steps and all these passes, and you can easily count them to see if the officer has administered the horizontal gaze nystagmus test correctly. Of the 3 field sobriety tests, that one is arguably the only scientific one. There's a lot of data that went into and research that went into establishing that if a person fails this test, and failure for this test is 4 out of 6 clues, okay? So if they fail this test, there's an 84% chance based on that test alone that this person is a 0.08 or greater. Okay, that's how accurate the science is. The problem with this test is most officers administer it incorrectly. That's the first one. Hardest for most jurors to understand, right? If I'm on the side of the road, I'm thinking the officer asked me to follow the stimulus, right? Because never would I tell the subject in the real world what my clues were. I would simply say, follow the tip of my stimulus, right? That's my test. I don't tell them these are the clues I'm looking for. So even when folks call me and say, hey, I've been arrested for a DWI, I think I did pretty good on the field sobriety test, what they're really telling me is, hey, when the officer asked me to follow the stimulus with my eyes, I did. I wasn't weaving or bobbing or stumbling. I stood there the whole time, because that's what they think the test is. That's not what the test is, right? So it's important to understand what the test is. And again, of the 3 field sobriety tests, that one is actually the most accurate, okay? Any questions about horizontal gaze nystagmus? Yes.
How does vertical nystagmus play into the HGN test?
So vertical gaze nystagmus is an additional type of nystagmus that can be checked for. And so the officer will take their stimulus and raise it above the person's head. And if you see vertical gaze nystagmus, it indicates a high level of intoxication for that person, not necessarily period, but for that person, that's a high level of intoxication. It's not necessarily always used, and I don't think it gets talked about in court very much. But yes, if you were an officer and you did vertical gaze nystagmus and the person showed vertical gaze, then they would be highly intoxicated for that person. Okay. Other questions?
So you mentioned that the shoulders are typically the barrier for the HGN test. What's happening if an officer is continually going outside of that range and the subject moves their head to follow the pen?
That's an improper administration of the test because it's supposed to be for it. So we use our shoulders kind of as a guideline, but the real accurate measurement would be a 45-degree angle. So if you start going out here, then it's an improper administration. Folks commonly, particularly if they've been drinking, when they're asked to follow the tip of the pen with their eyes and their eyes only, they always move their head. Very commonly move their head. And so officers all the time have to stop the test and say, using your eyes only, I want you to follow the tip of my pen. So if that happened, 1, the officer's administering it wrong, but 2, the officer should tell the person to get back into that position where they're looking forward and just follow with their eyes. Okay. Other questions?
Why do police not have to have a camera visual on the subject's eye?
So it's interesting. I've had a few boating while intoxicated cases, and on boating while intoxicated cases, they have visor cams, and on those cameras, you can see what the subject's eyes are doing. And I've literally had cases where the report said the warden saw 6 out of 6 clues on horizontal gaze nystagmus. You watch the video, and the person was never following the tip of the pen, period. So it's impossible for him to have seen the clues. I'm not saying bad officers or wardens or anything else, but I'm saying officers tend to put 6 out of 6 on every report that you ever come across, right? I can't think of the last time I saw a 2 out of 6 or 4 out of 6, right? Maybe some 4 out of 6s. But it's generally 6 out of 6, and it's almost a form that they fill out, right? They all think they're doing it right. They all think they're getting the clues, and they put down 6 out of 6. So I would say there hasn't been a push for visor cams, right? If it's kind of a hard subject to understand, right? So to get public outcry about why we don't have videos that track people's eyes, it'd probably just take too much. So right now it's just not something that's captured. Okay, so I'm going to administer the next two tests exactly as they would be administered if you were suspected of driving while intoxicated. Now I'm going to have you take your right foot, place it in front of your left foot, keep your hands down by your side, and remain into that position until I ask you to begin.
Okay.
Understand?
Yep.
Okay. When I ask you to, I'm going to have you take 9 heel-to-toe steps. You're going to, on the 9th step, keep your lead foot planted and turn around in a series of small steps.
Okay.
You're going to return taking 9 heel-to-toe steps. Do you understand my instructions?
Yeah.
I'm going to demonstrate that test for you. In demonstrating the test, I am going to take 3 steps. Obviously, you're going to take 9. Okay? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. You may begin.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Thank you. Okay. We're going to discuss that test
This is
in a bit, but I'm now going to give you some obnoxiously priced beer goggles,
Okay.
and these simulate a blood alcohol concentration of a 0.07 to a 0.10. All right, here, go ahead and put these on. Okay. If you feel like you're gonna fall, just stop the test, okay?
I'm committed.
But we're once again gonna do the walk and turn test. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna have you take one foot, place it in front of the other, hands down by your side.
Holy. This is tougher than it looks, guys. Okay.
Hands down by your side. I'm gonna have you maintain that position until I ask you to begin the test. Do you
Okay.
understand?
Yeah.
When I ask you to begin, I'm gonna have you take 9 heel-to-toe steps. On your 9th step, you're going to turn, keeping your lead foot planted. You're going to turn in a series of small steps. You're going to take 9 heel-to-toe steps and return to your starting position. Do you understand?
Yeah.
I'm going to demonstrate the test. In my demonstration, I'm going to take 3 steps. Instead of 9, you'll obviously take 9.
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Do you understand the test?
Yes.
You may begin.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm close to that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Very good. Thank you.
These
Nice job.
do
You
some
should give him a
work.
hand for that.
Seriously.
You guys are welcome to try it after, but that's quite the feat. As you guys were watching the walk and turn test, in many regards, the subject did well. He actually took 9 steps forward, took 9 steps back, didn't fall down. And as most people who have never reviewed a DWI case look at that, they might say, that's maybe better than I could have done or could do even right now with my physical limitations or any other limitations, right? Not necessarily the easiest task in the world. Notice what I did not tell the subject. I did not tell the subject what the 8 clues that I was going to score the test on were. That's not part of the instruction, right? So even DWI suspects, when they leave the scene, they might think they did a pretty good job on those field sobriety tests. But the clues are pretty small. The clues include if you are in that starting position with one foot in front of the other, arms down by your side, which I'll tell you is not a natural position to stand in or a comfortable one necessarily. If you do so much as use your arms for balance, or what a lot of people do, because these instructions sometimes take a while, they stand normally. Well, getting out of that starting position is a clue of intoxication on this test, okay? You're taking those 9 heel-to-toe steps. If your feet are apart more than half an inch, that's considered a clue of intoxication. If you do it on any of the 18 steps, more than half an inch, that's a clue of intoxication. If you get down here and you take your 9th step and you turn like this, that's a clue of intoxication. And you want to know why?
What wasn't planned?
Well, the officer told you to make a turn using a series of small steps, okay? Which is why the officer does this whole thing in demonstrating the test, right? So if you just pivot, that's considered an improper turn, right? So the clues of intoxication that the officer is told to use and look for are pretty minimal things, and they're not things that you've been told he's going to look for, right? It's like being given a test and you don't know what you're being graded on. You're just asked to put an answer down in a particular form. There are only 2 clues required to fail that test. Okay, so 2 clues out of 8 is a decision point for intoxication. Does that surprise anyone? It should surprise you. That test for many people would be hard to pass completely sober on a normal day, right? But that's the walk and turn test. Okay, for the last standardized field sobriety test, I'm gonna have you do the one leg stand. I'd like for you to stand with your feet together, arms down by your side. And when I ask you to begin, you're going to take 1 foot, you're gonna raise it 6 inches off the ground. You're gonna keep your foot level to the ground, keep your arms down by your side. You're gonna count 1001, 1002, until I tell you to stop.
Okay.
Do you understand the test?
Yes.
Okay. You may begin.
1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013, 1014, 1015, 1016, 1017, 1018, 1019, 1020, 1021, 1022.
Thank you. Okay. I won't make you complete the whole test, but
Okay.
an actual test, although the officer won't tell you this, takes 30 seconds. Okay. We're gonna try that test again, this time seeing if the beer goggles make any difference. Okay.
Okay.
So I'm gonna have you put those on
All right.
and tell me when you're ready to begin. You're gonna keep your feet together and your hands down by your side until I ask you to begin this test. When I ask you to begin, you're going to take 1 foot and raise that foot 6 inches off the ground.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to keep that foot level to the ground, and you're going to count aloud 1001, 1002, and so on until I tell you to put your foot down. During that time, you're going to keep your hands down by your side. Do you understand the test?
Yes.
You may begin.
1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006, 1007, 1008, 1009, 1010, 1011, 1012, 1013, 1014, 1015, 1016, 1017, 1018, 1019, 1020, 1021, 1022, 1023.
And this would continue for 30 seconds, but I'll ask you to go ahead and stop now. The one leg stand test is a test that has 4 clues. If you use your arms for balance, if you put your foot down, if you hop or you sway to keep your balance, those are all clues of intoxication. Once again, you only need 2 clues on the one-leg stand test to fail that test. Additionally, if you put your foot down 3 times, it's an automatic failure, okay? So in my example, the subject put his foot down 2 times, and if I had continued the test for the total 30 seconds that's required, it's possible he would have put his foot down again simply due to the fatigue of the unnatural position. And yet that alone, putting your foot down 3 times, would be an automatic failure, okay? So, field sobriety tests, when done, field sobriety tests, when administered correctly to the right segment of the population, can actually have very powerful results and very valid results. In fact, if you fail all 3 field sobriety tests and those tests were administered correctly, there's a 94% probability that you are over a 0.08. Okay, that's the combined effect of all 3 tests. Individually, the walk and turn and the one-leg stand would be in the 60s and 70s, but combined with the HGN, it is now over 90% accurate in predicting whether or not a person is a 0.08 or greater. But once again, the key factor here is the officer administering those tests correctly. That's what you're looking for as you're reviewing DWI videos, right? Because the narratives almost always say the same thing. It's like a checklist they go through. This is what I saw. But you're looking for what can actually be seen on video, okay? This is also why I advise people not to do field sobriety tests. If you're asked to do field sobriety tests, you politely decline them because it's very, very easy to fail. So if you were stopped and accused of driving while intoxicated, I would say be very polite, but don't do field sobriety because it's not going to help you, okay? In our example using the beer goggles, you see an example of just how disoriented you can actually feel, particularly when you're put in unnatural positions. Completely sober, it's difficult to do, right? So imagine you're doing that with something that has now affected potentially your judgment, your small muscles, perhaps even your large muscle groups, right? It's a state's burden. If they have a case they think they can prove, let them do it, right? If they get a warrant for your blood, of course you should not fight that. But it's their job to gather the evidence, not yours to provide it against yourself.
So the whole idea that you speak, is that not one of the tests? The doing the alphabet or anything like that? Is that part of a field sobriety test?
It's not part of the standardized field sobriety test battery, but alternative sobriety tests can be administered. So right now what we're talking about are the standardized field sobriety tests for people who are stopped driving, who can take these tests. You might have individuals who are not good candidates for different tests. Let's say one leg is in a cast, or they tell you they have a medical condition, or perhaps they're over the age of 60, which is the groups that were studied were all essentially under 50 when these tests were developed. So if you fall outside of those parameters, the officer might use other tests that can be helpful in just indicating whether or not the person has all their mental and physical faculties. Other questions? And there are many other non-standardized tests that the officers can use.
Difficult because I have seen a couple of the count from here to here backwards and like that. Do you have to do that? Could you refuse that as if you wanted to?
Absolutely. So although when officers ask you to do these things, it sounds more like a directive. So if I'm an officer investigating a DWI, I'm just saying, I'm going to have you do some field sobriety tests. That didn't sound like a question. I'm going to have you count backwards. But it is actually a request, and you do have the ability to say no. So it doesn't matter what the test is, you can politely say no. I'd rather not. That makes sense.
What can you offer some phrases of what somebody actually might say to an officer to politely decline, I work for an attorney's office, or I have an attorney friend, or something like that? What would be a way to politely decline?
That's a great question, because you don't necessarily want to say, my attorney told me not to do these tests, because then it sounds like you have an attorney, which raises other questions. But to say, I have a friend who is an attorney who told me not to do field sobriety tests, or even I just don't trust those tests would be a perfectly fine answer. You don't want to be combative or argumentative. Simply say no, I'd rather not. Thank y'all for being here and your questions, and particularly for volunteering to come up and do field sobriety tests. I really appreciate it and look forward to answering any other questions you might have about this subject.